Okay, so we're talking today as we start here about Greco-Roman religion. This is the stuff that is in chapter 5. And so, we're just doing an overview. I don't want to read every page of this, but I do want us to have sort of some overarching understanding of this. And the first thing is that the Greco-Roman world was very complicated, but not overly religious. And you see down there, at the second to last bullet point, worship of the Roman gods was a lot less about religion and a lot more about patriotism, right? That the gods were national. It's akin to the way that we treat maybe the American flag or the Liberty Bell, right? As symbols of nationalism, more so than symbols of religion. Yes, they believed in gods, but they believed in them as their national gods, and so it was patriotic, right? So if you have your Bibles, open them up to Acts chapter 17 really quickly. I know you know where we're going with this.
Oh, yeah. It's a great chapter.
Unknown God whom you ignorantly worship. So let me declare it unto you.
Oh, yeah.
You're probably sleeping.
So Acts chapter 17, verse 18. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, which we're going to talk about later, began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." So they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So it's not that he's advocating false gods; he's advocating foreign gods. So it was about the nationalism and the patriotism. So let's go back in time. What do you know about Homer? Not Homer Simpson.
Iliad.
Okay, yeah.
I know that.
An epic poet, wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. When I was a freshman at Faulkner, we had this program. I don't know how long it lasted, but it was called Great Books.
Oh, yeah. I was in there.
Were you? Okay. And so, yeah, that's the first thing you had to read was Homer and all that. And you sat around in this really awkward book club with all your college friends. It was a little strange, but, we did it. And so, that's kind of what you have to read. And so in the days of Homer, we're talking about 750-ish BC, you had the Olympian deities. So what are the Olympian deities?
Zeus, Hermes, Hades, Hera, Athena.
Yeah, all those, right? They lived on Mount Olympus, and they were the deities that were popular for that, for that period of time. By the time we get to the first century, though, there's very little belief in that. That has sort of become outdated. There is still some belief, though, and the greatest example of that is in Acts chapter 14, which I think we discussed yesterday, where they bow down and worship Paul and Barnabas because they think that they're Olympian gods. And so some of that is still present, so you can't discount that. But in large part, the worship of the Olympian deities by the time of Jesus is a thing of the past. Cicero and others couldn't conceive of a God with no bodies, right? So on page 125, there's a discussion of that. It says, the notion of the gods as having human form seems to have been one of the last vestiges of the Olympian cults to be discarded. Just a generation before the birth of Christ, Cicero could still assert that the notion of a God without a body is incomprehensible, for a bodiless deity would of necessity lack sensation and also wisdom and pleasure. All of these things are comprised in our conception of a deity, and that's from his Nature of the Gods. And so even in the first few centuries of the church, that was something that people had trouble with, right? What did Jesus say about that, about being spirit? Remember he said that God is spirit and we should worship him Yeah.
Sure.
So-
Worship, not spirit.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that people had trouble understanding was God being spirit. And so that sort of helps us see, part of that. As we mentioned, it's a patriotic duty. Of course, Zeus and Hermes there in Acts chapter 14, which we talked about. And one of the things that's interesting to me that I want to talk about for just a minute, it comes from page 127. One of the major issues that I think we'll have trouble understanding about Greco-Roman religion is their view of an afterlife, right? So what is the Christian view of the afterlife in your estimation?
Immortality with God, not being separated from God. We know the difference. That's the proof of the resurrection. That there is, like, we don't deal with reincarnation, being repurposed to anything else. The fact that there will be a place of eternal rest in the sense of our world will change. So there's a strong sentiment that people fail to believe because in the Greeks and Stoics, they didn't know what they were going to come back. They had their own ideology on that. They don't know if they're going to come back and to justify whatever they want to do. That's why everybody covered their bases. They had all those altars.
Yeah.
So you can come back whatever you want to come back as.
Yeah. Same.
Well, along with what Mike's saying, we're going to be changed like he is. So if God's spirit will be changed into that, to be like he is. So it's a more spiritual thing. It's not a physical, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, but if God's spirit were to be changed to be like him, it's going to be something else entirely. But I often think of, for us right now, paradise just being in a father's house kind of thing with Abraham, that kind of sense.
Yeah, I have a lesson that I was asked to do one time. I pulled it up the other day to talk about. I don't know if I saved it or not. Let's see. We believe in a place called heaven, right? We believe it's a real place. John chapter 14, I don't know if I can see that. We think about heaven as a city, a country, a house, a place, a temple, a throne. It's a garden-like paradise. All of these things.
What's crazy is that all those are just metaphors for what it'll really be like.
Like a new heaven, new earth kind of thing.
Yeah, like Jesus isn't the light, and he's not our vine, but it's a description of it.
Yeah, helping us try to understand it, right? When you think of the afterlife as eternal, there's several passages that we think about. One of my favorite lessons about heaven comes from a preacher named Jenny Allen, who was way before y'all's time. You may have heard
Does
of
he have commentaries?
No, he was a professor at Harding for a long time.
Seems like
But he talks about eternity and how long it is. It's just this really cool comparison. He uses one example. He said if you were to get a termite and let it start eating a piece of wood, he said as long as it would take that termite to eat every ounce of wood on planet Earth, eternity is still longer than that, right? Just all these different ways of thinking about how long eternity is. And the afterlife for us is eternal. It's one of the things that makes it unique. The wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. Heaven's a reward. We think about the afterlife as a reward, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 9 talks about that crown of life, not a perishable wreath. We think about the Corinthian games that took place in Achaia, and that's what they were trying to win, but that's not what we're trying to win. 2 Timothy 4, I fought the good fight, finished the race, I've kept the faith, now there's laid up for me the crown of life. Revelation 2:10, the crown of life for the faithful. I think our imagery sometimes of heaven as a reward is a bit skewed. Think about some of the songs that we sing, right? I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold, but in that city where the ransom will shine, I want a gold one that's silver lined, right? Well, what do gold and silver matter in heaven? Nothing, of course. The song, there's a holy and beautiful city whose builder and ruler is God. John saw it descending from heaven while Patmos and exile trod. Its high, massive walls are of jasper. The city itself is pure gold. Well, yeah, that's the description that we're given in the Bible, but what good is jasper? And none of that's going to matter in heaven. It's trying to help us understand.
Sorry to interject. There's a beautiful place called Heaven. That's a really good song too.
Yeah.
Running through that one in my mind.
All those songs.
How beautiful heaven must be.
Yeah.
But the scriptures only to our mindset that we can have an understanding of simulation.
Yeah.
I think back when the robe, the high priest wore the robe, and every stone had a specific meaning and how he was decked out. We can't fathom how heaven could be compared to what God has shown us morning. And those kind of images like that they carry the Catholic Church in their thing. That's why they went on their parade of trying to be, so audacious, I guess I would say. But one of the passages of scriptures I think about is when he says that our body will have a body that will be able to endure hell. To endure hell. And that it will change. I think about that. One day is like 1,000 like 1,000 years, one day is 1,000 years. But this body is going to be made to endure eternity.
Yeah, endure his presence.
Endure presence.
Yeah.
And endure the outcast too. That's a passage of scripture that frightens me. If I miss out on heaven, then I'm going to endure eternity, and there's nothing I can do about it.
This is kind of a side thought. It's something I've been thinking about recently. One of the key doctrines of it's not like salvation per se, but just it's in their Westminster confessions, is that they believe that God will be in hell, or in other words, that since God is omnipresent, omniscient, He knows everything that's going on everywhere, that God will be there punishing those in hell for eternity. And I texted Alan Webster a quote from Paul Washer that said as much. This was months ago. And said, I would love your thoughts on this. And I had already looked through everything. I was like, I don't know. And Alan just said something to the effect of, when Christ says, or something in Revelation where he says, they will otherwise be cast out. Or anyway, he said, it'll be away from my, anyways, he quoted a few verses like that. But I have heard the idea that God will be in hell punished. Now, does God know what's going on in hell? I mean, He's over all, but is He there? No, He's with the saints.
Yeah, and that's one of the beautiful promises, right? Being in God's presence. Heaven is a place of light, right? You think about darkness and how awful and scary darkness is. Heaven, in contrast, is a place of light in Revelation 21. Heaven is a place of rest. I realized this the other day when I was looking at this. That's Revelation 14:13, not 13:14. Blessed are those who would die in the Lord from now on. That's a Bible theme, right? Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. Ecclesiastes 7:1 says, the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. You know, I don't know that Solomon had the afterlife in mind necessarily when he wrote that, but he thought that life was meaningless and vain. But it says, those that die on the Lord will rest from their labors and their works follow. I was just thinking about Sunday night. When Sunday was a long, long day. We had, we have a little fellowship every Sunday morning for church. Get there at 9 and everybody has coffee and we have breakfast, together, just whoever wants to go. I had to do some work in the office Sunday morning to get ready for a couple things since I was going to be gone. And so taught my Bible class and preached and had baptism. We had a family that's been visiting, took them out to lunch, went home and packed and tried to prepare, get ready to come here. And it was almost midnight before I got here. And, got my stuff unpacked and made sure I was ready for class Monday morning. And that feeling of laying down in that bed after a long day, it's just wonderful, right? Or after you've been, out physically exercising all day, you take that shower and you lay down and you rest. That's what heaven's going to be like forever. And that's an amazing thing. No more stress, no more physical infirmities, no more back pain, and no more hurting feet, no more migraines, and no more any of that. It's all gone. It's just a place to rest. I went last week, heard one of my good buddies, Jake Sutton, preach a lesson about who won't be in heaven. This kind of goes along with this next point that heaven's going to be a perfect place. No sickness, no death, no pain, no sorrow. There won't be any doctors in heaven. There won't be any police officers. There won't be any firemen. Not that all those people are condemned, you know what I'm saying? There'll be no need, right? There'll be no construction workers. Any of that stuff. Reminds me of a joke I heard. Said that Nick Saban died and went to heaven. I'm not going to make any other comments on that, but Nick Saban died and went to heaven, and they got there. The Lord walked by and said, "This is your house," and it was this house is decorated with Alabama banners and flags. And Nick Saban sort of looked at it and said, "Oh man, that's great." And, he looked up the hill, and there was this giant mansion. 10 times bigger than that. And, it had Auburn flags hanging high everywhere, banners. Nick Saban said, "Man, that must have been somebody great. Whose house is that?" And God said, "Oh, Nick, that's my house," which I thought was a funny joke.
Wow.
But listen, if God's an Auburn fan, he has a funny way of showing it. I'll say that. But heaven is a place that's perfect, right? And it's a place where there's none of those things exist. And so it's a place of perfection and rest, not just from our physical labors, but from all the stresses of life that plague us. Heaven's a reunion, right? We can go and be reunited with the saints. There's some people that don't believe that, but Abraham believed it, right? Genesis 25:8 said he died and he was gathered to his people. Well, that's not talking about where his bones are buried, right? He's reunited with his people. Jacob believed that when Joseph died, that he would get to see him again. David, when his son died because of his sin with Bathsheba, he said, "I will be able to go to him." And so heaven is all these things. And so we said, and we see the biblical picture of the afterlife, and we long for the afterlife, right? We desire the afterlife. We want to be part of it. In the ancient world, that was not so. They did not understand or conceive of an afterlife. And here on page 127, we see that, right? The Olympian gods, this is about halfway down the page, do not hold out to the individual any hope of a pleasant afterlife either. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, Homer describes the gray, semi-conscious souls, and of course that's the same word we see for soul in Greek there in the Bible, of the dead drifting around in the underworld. Achilles tells the visiting Odysseus it's better to be a humble farmer slave on the surface of the earth than to be the king of the underworld. It's a bleak outlook. It says that immortality to the Greeks and Romans was leaving behind the sun to carry on your name, to have some military glory, to have something that you leave behind in the world, that is, that's your immortality. There's no hope of a paradise in the afterlife. And so just sort of have that in mind. They're all about fame during this life as a form of their immortality. Yes.
Well, you brought that up yesterday with one of the kings, that he wanted himself to be remembered, Tiberius, and so that's why he put Caligula in there.
Yeah.
He's like, well, here's a crazy guy to make me look even better when I'm gone.
That's right. Yeah. So it was all about that, because there was no hope of a happy afterlife.
The contrast is there's still some people live in today's world live like that. They live like that. If you remember when we had the economic fall back in 2007, some people believe that it was better to take their family out with them because they had no other hope in their life. They used reverse on that. That's sad, because you don't know how to suffer. And then you put yourself in an eternal state because you don't know God. You made yourself the God of this world. And so that's what you want your legacy to be.
Very true. We get caught up in our own immortality here. It's a great point. There's a quote here at the bottom of the page from Pliny the Younger, it just kind of talks about him and his uncle, Pliny the Elder. They deny their existence. It says they even have tombstones that express widespread pessimism about the afterlife. That's kind of weird, because we think it's a tombstone, gone but not forgotten, enjoying the beauty of the afterlife. And these people are like, yeah, he's just like Rover, dead all over. Right? There's not that excitement about the potential of the afterlife. What a sad existence, right? To be fighting and scratching and clawing in this world for your glory. That's why I love 2 Corinthians 4 so much. It says that we're waiting on something that will be so much more glorious, and the struggles of this life will pale in comparison to what we go through. So, emperor worship. Beginning with Alexander the Great, Greco-Roman rulers were sometimes called gods. Aristotle, you guys are familiar with the line of philosophy, right? From Socrates to Plato to Aristotle. And Aristotle is actually the teacher, the tutor of Alexander the Great. And so he calls Alexander a god man in some ways. And so he basically said, to do this, you would have to be God. And so Aristotle teaches that a great leader is a god among men. So you start to see this idea of men being gods. So Caesar Augustus, when Julius Caesar dies, he has him deified. Notice though, he doesn't necessarily do it to himself. Augustus allows himself to be worshipped in the eastern provinces, where that would have been accepted, but not in the more cynical western part. Tiberius, same thing. And so Caesar was deified posthumously, but Augustus was not so much. And this was something that was interesting. Augustus was a very interesting guy. You go back and you read some of the things he wrote. One of the things I failed to mention yesterday, and he was writing a letter to someone, and he talked about Herod the Great. And he told them that he would rather be a pig than a relative of Herod the Great, because Herod the Great wouldn't kill and eat a pig, but he would kill his own family, right? Because of Jewish culture. And so he was very clever. And so he was astute enough not to allow himself to be worshipped by people that would have had a problem with it. Caligula comes along, no? And Caligula wants to be called master and God. And this is a problem for Christians, because the Bible is very clear. We should not call anybody else what? Or Lord, right? Shouldn't call anyone Lord. And so this was a big problem for Christians. But truthfully, the emperors didn't necessarily think that they were gods. It was sort of one of those things that just helped them get power. Domitian took on master and God. Of course, we talked about this being very troubling to Christians. But I love this quote at the top of 129 from Vespasian. As he was dying, he made a joke. He said, "Oh my, I think I'm becoming a god." And this is recorded, of course, by Suetonius, who's our main source of that. And so it was sort of a joke that, oh yeah, I'm a god because I'm the emperor. So not something they necessarily believed, but something that helped them have power. And so just sort of be aware of that. Emperor worship was a very important thing. The people worshiping the emperors as gods, but outside of probably Caligula and Domitian, the emperors were aware that they were not gods, right? They didn't really.
They didn't oppose their will like gods as much. They allowed the people just to go ahead and do it. Domitian, he opposed his will. That's why we're talking about revelations, but that's why the persecution. And I could not fathom being a slave in the house of Domitian and have obeyed the gospel. You know, have to listen to some of the letters of being submissive to civil authority, knowing directly. That just brings out the deeper impact of Christianity, because all those slaves that were in the province of Rome had to understand who they were really serving. So when he was saying, "I want you to serve as you would serve unto the Lord," I mean, that would be like, wow, really? We don't, I don't, we complain about our political system. Wait a minute. If you don't give me the respect I want, I have you, your family, everybody else on.
Yeah. It's I think it shows more so than anything is how separate we're supposed to be as Christians from the affairs of the world. It doesn't matter what is going on in the world, you still serve. And that's hard to fathom sometimes.
It's important. Comment as well. Do you think it's possible that those, and I don't know, I'm continually asking, do you think it's possible that those who did embrace emperor worship, that logically this makes sense, that many did it not because they esteemed him as a god? I'm sure many did, whatever, but to gain good favor or good standing.
Well, it's about like that one letter that was written to Tiberius? The guy who said, "I had them pour wine out with your statue beside the statues of the gods." I don't know if it was to Tiberius or
I vaguely recall that.
Yeah.
at the beginning. He did that. "Oh, your statue's up here with the gods."
Yes, exactly. Yeah, to remind you of who you are. So, yeah, just kind of be aware of that. So another thing that is prominent here is miracles, magic, and holy men. You can read the section for yourself, but that was a big deal, and it was a big deal in the Bible. That's one of the reasons that I believe that God chose to let the apostles work miracles, because this was something that people saw as legitimate. And if you'll turn over to Acts chapter 19, there's a passage I will look at there. We're in verse 11. And, Samuel, if you don't care, read verses 11 through 21 there.
Yes, sir. God was performing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that handkerchiefs or aprons were even carried from his body to the sick, and the diseases left them, and the evil spirits went out. But also some of the Jewish exorcists who went from place to place attempted to name over those who had the evil spirits the name of the Lord Jesus, saying, "I adjure you by Jesus whom Paul preaches." 7 sons of Sceva, a Jewish chief priest, were doing this. And the evil spirit answered and said to them, I recognize Jesus, and I know about Paul, but who are you? And the man in whom was the evil spirit leaped on them and subdued them and overpowered them, so that they fled out of the house naked and wounded.
Pause right there. So, number one, in addition to it being funny, can you imagine? You don't know if it's all nonsense or not. You just want to go and be like Paul, and you speak to that spirit, and that evil spirit says, I know who Jesus is. I know who Paul is. Who do you think you are? Man, imagine the feeling of terror.
You get beat down.
Yeah, right.
You get beat down, you make it.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
With James, even the demons know, they shudder.
Yeah.
Verse 17. This became known to all, both Jews and Greeks who lived in Ephesus, and fear fell upon them all, and the name of the Lord Jesus was being magnified. Many also of those who had believed kept coming, confessing and disclosing their practices. And many of those who practiced magic brought their books together and began burning them in the sight of everyone. And they counted up the price of them and found it 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing. Now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome.
So Paul wins the minds of the Ephesians through this attempt by the sons of Sceva, and also through the fact that he's able to perform these miracles. They believed not necessarily the message, but through the signs. And this is a common part of the ancient world. And even in the Jews, right? The Jews wanted a sign and a wonder and a work. And so this is a huge part of Greco-Roman society. And even things like secret symbols. The Christians made use of those. He talks about here on page 130, if you had a chance to see that, about the Greek word for fish. And so that is an acrostic for, Jesus Christ, God's Son. And so you had that symbol. And he talks about the possible symbol here, the square. And I know y'all have seen this, that turns out to be a cross, and turns out to have Alpha and Omega and all those things, and which is the beginning of the Lord's Prayer in Latin. And so whether that was or was not the case, we know that symbols and imagery were a big part of that. And so ancient, magic spells and all those things were interesting. Some Romans were obsessed with oracles and astrology and dreams and all these mystical things, one of which was Tiberius. Tiberius was very, very fascinated by these things. And so just kind of keep that in mind, that you have that as very much a foundation of beliefs in the ancient world, and they were obsessed with them. Whereas now, people that believe in this thing, they're sort of on the fringe of society, right? If you have somebody who goes to visit a psychic, or you have somebody that, believes in those things, palm readings and all that, they're sort of on the fringe of society. That was not the case in the ancient world. That would have been very much something that was mainstream and something that was accepted.
Solomon.
Yeah, the witch at Endor, yeah.
Well, what I like about this passage is that it still shows the converting of the church in Ephesus. They had already obeyed the gospel, but yet they were still doing practices in their house. And God used this to bring out some things. This concept, let's say today with the horoscopes, there's some people that believe in horoscopes and they're Christians. And they don't think it's a form of witchcraft or anything else like that, but it's a small step in the edge to allow a man or your own conscience to prove something. You're on the edge of Gnosticism. You don't even think about it like that. Yeah. Get the newspaper. Oh, what's the horoscope say today? Oh, I'm a Sagittarius. I'm this, I'm that. You're a child of God. What are you doing?
Yeah, okay. I get kind of tickled sometimes. Sometimes we go a little overboard. I teach at a Christian school, and we have a fall festival coming up in October, and they said you could wear costumes, but they can't be anything that has to do with ghosts or ghouls or goblins. And one of the things it says is no Harry Potter costume. I got kind of tickled at that. Some little kid that wants to be Harry Potter, and it's like, which,
All of a sudden, Salem witch trial.
Yeah, right. So, but certainly we have to keep things separated from that, and the Bible, talks about that. I don't want to spend too much time on this. You can read this for yourself on page 133 and 134. Animism is the fear and propitiation of spirits. It was a common form of worship. It said divinities were thought to dwell in trees and caves and rivers and boundary stones and other natural objects. And so some of the very bright people felt that same thing. I always kind of tell you to watch out for the gray boxes.
You're talking about.
If you've ever wandered into a grove crowded with ancient trees which have grown to a remarkable height, blocking the view of the sky with their intertwined branches, the very height of the forest, along with the seclusion of the place and your awe at such dense shade in an open spot, will convince you of a divine presence. If some cave created by crumbled rocks supports a mountain, a place not fashioned by hands but dug out into such roominess by natural causes, your soul will be struck by a certain suggestion of reverence. We venerate the sources of great rivers. We build altars where great streams suddenly break out of their hidden sources. We worship the sources of hot springs, and we consider certain pools sacred because of their dark waters or great depth. And that is from Seneca, who's an intellectual and an advisor of the emperor. And so this was certainly something that lots of people, believed in. And so you need to have in your mind as you understand that, they're worshiping gods, but there's also this belief in the mythical. And one of the ways that that's seen is the mystery cults. These are very, very popular. And before we get into that, we'll take a break. It's about 10:30. I kind of got to go to the bathroom. I'm sure maybe some of y'all do too. So we'll take a quick bathroom break and we'll look at those mystery cults when we come back. And we just have a couple more slides before we move on to the next section. All right, so we're back looking at Greco-Roman religion, and I'm not going to go in detail on these mystery cults. If you're very interested in them, you can read about them. That might make an interesting paper.
I was just thinking about that.
You can look at those. The Eleusinian mysteries. One of the things that is interesting about them, and this is talked about on the bottom of page 136. It says, we do not know the exact content of the ritual. There were 3 stages of initiation, which took at least 6 months to complete. The actual initiation ceremony began with the initiates bathing in the sea and then joining in a public procession to Eleusis. This bathing process has been linked to the Christian practice of baptism. And so they went through something similar to baptism to join these mystery cults. The cult of Dionysus, also known as Bacchus or Father Liber, was another god of vegetation, and it says especially of the grape. And it was only open to women, which is pretty unique. But it was one of those people would go and leave. I think we talked about this the other day. They would leave their home for several days and go into the woods and drink themselves into frenzy, and it was part of their worship. Says the Greeks feared the cult at first and took steps to ban it, but there was a play by Euripides that showed how powerful it was. Things calmed down over time, but the cult's practices, it says, became more subdued as time passed with a communal meal, sometimes taking the place of animal sacrifices. A temple was built next to the larger temple of Apollo in Delphi, symbolic of the subjugation of madness to reason. But the Romans didn't like it, we mentioned, not because of the religious practices, but because they were meeting at night in the woods and in secret. So the Romans don't like it, and the government executed a bunch of its adherents and that was a source of conflict. And so that is one that is pretty significant, that comes out of this Greco-Roman religion that was very antagonistic towards the Romans. The Orphic cult is another mystery cult, comes around 6th century BC. It's around the poet Orpheus. And if you remember the story from your ancient history, he was the one that went into the underworld to retrieve his wife. And he convinced Pluto and Persephone to let her go, but he turns around to check on her and she's gone. And so it's this story of him trying to retrieve his wife. Some Jews, it says of the early Christian period, identified Orpheus with David in his role as a poet and a musician. And we don't really know that much about it because nothing really survived. And so
He was a son of Apollo, apparently.
yes, and so that's another one of those. The Great Mother, and this was one that was from Asia Minor. You can read about it. And, it's one of those things that the Romans couldn't officially oppose it, but they weren't a big fan of it. It says each spring devotees reenacted the murder and restoration of Attis in a tearful public spectacle before the private initiation took place. It was active all over the Eastern Mediterranean world. It says the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel berated the women of Jerusalem because they took part each spring in the wailing for Attis. And so this is something that's very ancient. It's going for a long time. And Bell says that the origins of the word Easter come from this particular group. And so you can read about that all you want to. Isis there is an Egyptian goddess. And of course, that is not a name that's unique to the modern terror organization. This is another one of the mystery cults. And in this one, Mithraism, it was extremely popular, sometimes even rivaled Christianity. This is interesting too. Mystery cults were not exclusive. So you could be a Christian and a member of a cult. You could be part of different cults. It was akin to being a member of the Lions Club and the Optimist Society or whatever. You could be in kind of multiple ones. But maybe the thing that's interesting to us the most about Mithraism is the feast day was December the 25th. That date was also the climax of the Saturnalia. And of course, December 25th is adopted at some point in Christianity to be the date for Christmas. And so we can go back and check those out. And if you're interested in the mystery cults, I am not all that interested in them, I will confess to you, but if that's something that is interesting to you, there's a lot of research available out there and a good bibliography at the end of this chapter. So, of course, we know in the mid-4th century, the bishops of Rome began celebrating December 25th. We talked about his actual birth yesterday, so we're not going to rehash that. The Eastern Orthodox Church, it celebrates January 6th as the day of his baptism and spiritual birth. And then Paul probably had these words in mind when he chooses the Greek word mysterion for mystery in some of his writings. And if you have studied the New Testament extensively, which I know you have, Paul uses that word quite a bit, right? Well, that word would have grabbed the attention of first century audiences because of these mystery cults. And so when, especially in the book of Ephesians, chapter 3, when he talks about the mystery being revealed, that's something that would have been used. He also used it when writing to the church at Rome, which would have been, familiar with these mystery cults as well. Let's save Gnosticism for this afternoon because I want to talk about it, and we may save it actually for tomorrow because I want to talk about it in context of early Christianity more so than in this context of Greco-Roman religion. And so, just kind of know those things when we have our tests. There may be one or two questions about the mystery cults, but it is something that very much was a part of modern society in the same way that this obsession with mysticism and the miracles and the signs were. That was all very much part of the culture. The idea of worshiping one God in spirit and in truth and in the way that we do would have been very, very foreign this society. And so that's why they looked at Christians so suspiciously, because they were doing things so differently than they were used to. Right. Let's go back here. I'm going to buy the Bibles today.
How long is the tour at the
As long as we want it to be. And so you have a tour guide that'll sort of show you some things, but what we did last time is we kind of broke away and went, it won't take any longer than a couple hours.
I'm gonna miss tomorrow afternoon. I have to take my wife to an appointment tomorrow.
That's okay.
No, I want to tell you this.
No problem. All right, let's jump into this a little bit, and then we'll break for lunch in about 20 minutes or so. So Greco-Roman philosophy. So we have said that Greco-Roman religion is not something that people shared a lot of dedication to. It's not something that people got in a lot of arguments about. It's not something that people were very devoted to. Philosophy, on the other hand, was. Philosophy is where the devotion would be given. And so the first time that we see philosophy comes about 580 BC, and from that point moving forward, the Greeks had what the Bible calls an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Right? They were just obsessed with it, and it became one of those things that people really focused on. And so the pre-Socratics, they're interested in natural science, water, air, earth, fire, and that was sort of the interest in things. And so as you look into it, you're going to see a couple of different people. Empedocles decides that the fundamental matter was a mixture of water, air, earth, and fire. And this is on page 163. And it's drawn together by the power of eros, which is love, and torn apart by the destructive power of eris, which is strife. And so all the things in the world, according to Empedocles, were brought together by love and destroyed by strife, which is kind of poetic. Also doesn't make any sense, right? But, you think about that. And so that was one of the schools of thoughts. And then you have, and I always have trouble with these names, Leucippus and Democritus. They find the explanations in the uncuttable or the indivisible, which is kind of interesting because it's pretty advanced scientifically for this time in history. So they think that it lays in the smaller part of the atom or the uncuttable, which combines with other atoms to make all forms of matter, which move randomly through infinite space. Christian writers from the 1st to the 18th centuries tried to credit Moses with that idea, it says. And so the Greek philosophers wanted to know how or why things change. And so they were looking at the world and trying to find the structure to it and answer the questions, the big questions of the world. And so we see this very early on as part of history. Parmenides and Zeno of Elea, among others, thought that change was equal to imperfection. They thought that it was an illusion. So if things weren't staying the same, there must be strife and they must be imperfect. And they thought that it was an illusion. So you have all of these as sort of background schools of thought. And then you have Socrates. He takes philosophy and takes it as, instead of being a study of nature, it's the study of mankind, which is what we know of philosophy today. And so Socrates is important in that way. What are some things we know about Socrates from outside of the book?
His apology or his defense before he died. Something I read recently. And basically it was taken for being a bad influence on children, teaching them.
And that's actually why he was executed.
Yeah,
For- Yeah, and he's executed by drinking hemlock. And he has some very famous quotes. The unexamined life is not worth living, right? Is Socratic. The initial institute of studying philosophy, the Socratic method. So Socrates is huge. He also introduces the notion of the soul. The notion of the soul is introduced by Socrates. But there's a quote on here, and for the first time I read this, I thought this was a little bizarre, but kind of interesting. This is starting on page 164. So starting down there, the second to last paragraph, like Jesus, Socrates wrote nothing that survived and ended his life in an apparent failure. He is known to us at all because of the impression he made on his contemporaries who praised or criticized him in their writings. Okay? Next paragraph. Comparisons are sometimes drawn between Socrates and Jesus, but at this point, Socrates resembles the Jewish scribes more than he does Jesus. And so, what do we make of this comparison that people have drawn between Socrates and Jesus, besides being sacrilege in some ways? Why would people even put those thoughts together?
Because Socrates had a way with words in that he would use common day illustrations and often mathematics to just reason with people to get them to understand for themselves what something means. And Jesus would often do the same in parables when he would use a similar circumstance to make it logical and to reach a logical conclusion that would ultimately be what is true on the matter. And so I guess the search for that which is true would combine. Now, why it's sacrilegious is that, well, I don't know enough about Socrates to say, obviously he's before Christ, but whether he was godly or not, I'm assuming he's anything but. But yeah, to say he's more like, I mean, I guess he would be more like the Jewish rabbis who saw, what did Paul say about him? They have a zeal for knowledge, right? And so I think the same thing for Socrates and the Athenians and the Epicureans and Stoics and whoever else. It is zeal for the most knowledge possible. But Christ, he's different in so many ways. He was God, for one. He created the world. He knew it all. He was the epitome of truth. And I don't know. That's my initial.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
We look for similarities. I mean, these line up and that kind of stuff, so.
Yeah.
Surely it must mean more than that.
Yeah. I think that certainly, and there's something I have bracketed here in my book. Socrates' influence on Western thought should not be undervalued, however, because he did not inspire his society to rise to modern standards in certain areas. His legacy includes the insistence on the precise definition of terms, the Socratic method of inquiry, which elicits information by asking questions rather than stating things dogmatically, which Jesus did do that, and the exalted concept of the nature of the soul. To some degree, his ideas had an impact on Christian thought in the first few centuries. And so I think that, maybe we're looking for those connections, but certainly Jesus did some things that were Socratic. He did not dogmatically state things, he asked questions, right? So if you ever go and you read any Socrates, it's always questions, right? And so rhetoric is an important part of this whole system, right? Whoever could speak the most eloquently or make the most eloquent point.
That's the point I was going to make, is that he founded a lot of the rhetoric, philosophies, and principles that help us today. And I thought about Matthew 7, Jesus, when they said, we don't teach like the Pharisees and scribes, we teach one as I have authority and power. Socrates would embody a concept and make use use of self-examination. Therefore, you're rendered to answer your own question, but and let the powerful influence on you. So I thought about the rhetoric part. I think a lot of the early preachers use rhetoric, true rhetoric, to display not only their ability but their knowledge in writing and in debating and explaining. We see that in the early first century and even prior to that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just thinking about it, you can think this about any character, individual from pre-Christ or after post-Christ. Socrates didn't have any writings that survived, and yet, as far as I know, every human being would say, "Oh yeah, Socrates lived. He was alive. He did this, and he believed that." It comes to Jesus, like, "Oh, I don't know." We have Jesus' writings and exactly what he said verified by extra-biblical research. But I don't think he
Trying to find this particular philosopher. His name has left my mind, but there were even brothers that went around as a rhetoric team. I remember being in a philosophy class in college. I took a philosophy class with my younger brother, who was a student at Auburn at the time as well, and he referred to us as that, which always kind of tickled us. But it was standing at the city gates and discussing things back and forth. This was the glory of the day, and it was the word heresy that we use for religion actually comes from Greek philosophy, right? If you disagreed with the prominent philosophy of the day, you were a heretic. It had nothing to do with religion, but instead focused on philosophy. Turning to philosophy was a conversion. And, certainly that still applies today if we convert to something and make that change. The relationship between Plato and Socrates is fascinating. Everything that we know about Socrates comes from Plato. And so it's very interesting. Of course, Plato has his own writings, but in antiquity, the oral tradition was the standard for passing on information. And so writing did not become a standard until later. And so as we think about early Greek philosophy, right, it's Socrates and it's Plato. And so Plato, of course, goes to Athens and builds the academy, which becomes a haven for skepticism. And Jesus plays into that as well. We're going to come back and look at a little bit more of this in detail after lunch, but I want us to be aware of a few of the names, kind of. So from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, those are the three names that you want to remember. And then Aristotle's pupil is Alexander the Great. So if I was to ask you about the first four great students of philosophy, I want you to say something like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Alexander the Great. The Lyceum is founded by Aristotle, and then of course the Stoics and the Epicureans dominate this time period. And so I don't want us to undervalue how important philosophy is and how much it matters. And so after we get back from lunch, we'll talk about a little bit more of that.
Even with Roman Marcus, one of the Roman emperors, I think Aurelius or something like that.
Marcus Aurelius, yeah.
Marcus Aurelius, he was a firm believer in Stoicism. And so that form of philosophy, he believed very much in that. And that's still a thing. Are you a Stoic kind of person today? Or, those kind of things.
Yeah.
Well, we get to the Renaissance age and we really see philosophy take off in a whole other different manner. Immanuel Kant and other writers, philosophers who were looking at things that were happening in their church went against it because they understood that they weren't living what they were practicing. And so philosophy the Renaissance age changed a lot when we look at philosophy, which forces us to go back to Aristotle, to Plato, to Socrates, and see how they reason, and then how we come to the knowledge of Christ. That period is so vast with so much information. Absolutely.
schedule on some of this stuff. Kind of thinking about this, you'll tell me what you think. We'll pause the recording.